Good morning, Maddie. How you doing? I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. There is an emotional component. I've gone 2-3 days without my Eustachian tube clicking, and as soon as I sit down to do this, click. So we're gonna bag Bangkok Buckaroo. I think I've proven that it will take a much better performer than myself to do that book justice. It's just all full of dialects, and I no longer have a facility, apparently, for dialects. So we're going to leave that to the side. It's not my best book anyway. It was just a little bit of fun, and it's not fun, I think, the way I've been presenting it. So we're going to skip that book. We're going to go right to the last book, which is called Leaving Thailand, which I think has a terrific cover by David Squires. I will forever be in David Squires' debt for that cover. These are photos of my life in which I have been removed. So Leaving Thailand, a memoir, is about leaving Thailand in 1997 and the things that happened subsequent to that. It is Memoir, which is what I went to the University of Iowa Graduate School to study, the art of creative nonfiction. The rule in creative nonfiction is you can leave out anything you want, but you cannot add anything. Obviously, telling the story of my life for this roughly 20-year period this book covers would take 20 years if you included absolutely everything that happened. It would take 20 years to tell that story. So obviously, you have to leave stuff out when you write autobiography or memoir, in this case, memoir. The difference, of course, autobiography covers the author's life from birth to the time of writing. A memoir is a memory of a specific period of time. So this is Memoir, and yeah, it's all about Steve, but that's what memoir is. It is a subjective memory of a period of time. Now this cover, my daughter, Mandy, said that she was very angry that I'd used this photo of her and her brother and her mother. And she cut off all contact with me, and I have not heard from her since, I think, 2018 was when she did that. And I'm sorry about that, but I don't think this is the reason. I think this was something, she was not comfortable telling me the real reason. And I will wait. Someday maybe she'll tell me, maybe she won't. But I don't think the cover is the reason. And I love this cover. Like I said, I'm very grateful to David for this cover. So the oldest writing in this is the second essay in it. The newest writing is the preface. The only thing written specifically for this book is the preface. There is 20 years plus of my writing in this book, the best, I think, writing over 20 years, maybe longer. We'll have to do the math together. But I compiled it, I put it all together and wrote a preface for it. The last piece, the last essay in this book is about a visit to Pattaya I made in 2019, I think. The only time I've ever been to Pattaya. So the preface, like I said, because I write primarily memoir, and of course you only pick out the interesting bits of your life to write about, and people read my writing and say, well, you're making this up. This didn't really happen. You're making all this up. No, you can't. That's the rule. You can't make anything up. You can't add anything that didn't happen. You can leave shit out. So you leave out all the dull bits. You just include the interesting bits. And people think, well, nobody's life is this interesting. That's just how the genre works. And they give a Pulitzer every 2 years for memoir. So it is a respected genre. Going back to Montaigne in the 1800s. Like he said, Montaigne said, my life is my book. That's it. You don't make anything up. Your life is your book. But it's subjective. And we, of all the different kinds of testimony in court, a witness's account of a crime is the least weighted because we have faulty memories. We have faulty perceptions. We're all like the 5 blind men trying to describe an elephant. And so this memoir is my perspective of the events. And maybe I get something wrong. That's inherent in the form. So here's the preface. Let's start at the beginning of the book with the preface. Let's start with the dedication. This was published in 2020, by the way, self-published on Amazon. It's the only book that's available on paper on Amazon other than old used copies of the original publications. The young men are late for class. It's 7 o'clock. They're late for class at the Voc Tech College. They drive really fast on this road. Dedication for Colin Pipperell, who suggested it 20 years ago. For Dana Hayden, who suggested it 10 years ago. For Tim Hallinan, David Squires, Jim Alge, and Dean Parrott, who finally talked me into it. Yeah. When I left Thailand in 97, Colin Pipperell, my editor at Phuket Magazine, said, well, since you're going to go learn how to be a writer, write about this, write about Thailand. And I never did for 20 years. Dana Hayden was a monger, a sex tourist, a career sex tourist from Boston. And he and I argued like cats and dogs online for many, many years. And then we became friends, never met the guy, never been in the room with the guy. Now I think he is having health problems and living in Boston, and he will never return to Thailand, unfortunately. But Dana suggested I do the same thing, more in the tone of, if you think you're that interesting, write a book about yourself, that kind of a thing. And then these other people who did finally in 2020 talk me into making this book. Preface. Listen, let me tell you a story. In the winter of 1983, I was living in a studio apartment on 43rd Street and 8th Avenue in New York City. I was working as an office temp to fund my efforts at launching a career as a movie prop man. So far, the best I had done was a regular gig as a production assistant for a company that made rock videos. MTV was a new thing, and every garage band that could scrape together $10,000 was making a video. I was elated when they called me at my day job and said they wanted me to shop props for a video. Finally, something more interesting than carrying sandbags or cable around the set. After clerking that day, I went to their office and met the designer, got a shopping list and $400 cash. The designer said, "We're really psyched about this gig. We think it's going to lead to a lot of work. The drummer is Deborah Harry's brother." It was my first real work in the New York showbiz. And I left their office about 8 p.m., walking on clouds. I was finally, officially, a set decorator. The guy who gets paid to go shopping in Manhattan with other people's money. Best job in the world. And it was. I got off the subway at Times Square. This was the pre-Giuliani Times Square. Dirty, dangerous, hectic, every other business a bar or a porn theater or a cheap hotel. A cop on every street corner, hookers and drug dealers in every doorway. I was walking west on the north side of 42nd Street. There were street lights, light from the porn theater marquees, and headlights on the traffic going by. Where there was light, it was bright. Where there was shadow, it was pitch black. The pavement was slimy from a cold rain that had just ended, and from whatever was leaking out of the wet garbage bags piled shoulder high in the alleyways. The sidewalk was crowded. The Port Authority terminal is right there, and at 8 p.m. on a weeknight, the place is jammed with commuters. When an old lady ran past me, knocking my elbow, I barely noticed, but I noticed her outfit. She had on slacks and a big fur coat. She wore a massive gray fur hat, like a Russian soldier. She was tiny and obviously old, but very spry, and she was trying to catch a bus at the curb. She shouldered her way through the crowd like a native New Yorker. I was rooting for her to catch her bus. The bus closed its door and pulled away, but she kept chasing it. She was reaching up to bang on the door when her foot slipped off the curb and she went head first into the side of the moving bus. She sort of bounced down the length of the bus before landing splat in the gutter. And I saw the back wheels of the bus go over her legs. I dropped my canvas messenger bag with the $400 in it, and I jumped off the curb. I knelt down next to her. All I could think of was to hold her hand and ask her questions to keep her talking. I put my coat under her head, and she told me her name was Enola Day. I swear to God. She was a piano teacher going home after a lesson. She was 70 years old. Like I said, there was a cop on every corner and a firehouse on 43rd Street, so the ambulance was there lickety-split. And while they loaded Mrs. Day into it, I gave a statement to the cops. The cops left, and I put my filthy coat back on, and then suddenly I remembered my bag. I looked all around, but it was gone. My first real budget, and I'd left it on the sidewalk in Times Square at rush hour. $400 was a lot of money in 1983. Those were Reagan dollars. My rent was only $50 a week. In the morning, I'd have to call the production company and tell them I'd lost their props budget and had no way to pay it back. I'd never get another job in the show business, not even as a production assistant. But then this skinny black man, maybe 20 years old, in greasy clothes and shoes without laces, stepped out of a doorway, looked at me as if I was a dim-witted child, and handed me my bag. "You need be more careful with your shit, man." I took the bag, and without another word, he walked off down the street. In a second, he was lost in the crowd. New York, you gotta love it. So about a week later, I'm home with the flu, and a lawyer from the city calls me. I was the only person on the street that night who was willing to give a statement to the cops. Mrs. Day was suing the city. He wanted to interview me about my statement. I was congested and achy and snotty and miserable, but I told him he could come over. He came over and he brought me hot tea with lemon from the deli. I repeated what I told the cops, and he shook his head. He closed his notebook. Are you willing to testify under oath to everything in your statement? Sure, I said. Well, he said, that's a shame. Why? Well, normally you'd be the perfect witness. You're educated and you're sober. You're also the only witness available. Usually both sides would be happy to hear your testimony. But you say you saw the bus wheels go over Mrs. Day's legs. She was in my office this morning with her lawyer. She's walking around fine. She's asking for money because she bumped her head on the bus. And he left. Excuse me. I never heard from anybody else about this incident. Gun to my head, I would swear to you right now that I saw the sweeping back and forth of taxi cab headlights, that in the sweeping back and forth of taxi cab headlights, I saw those wheels go over those skinny old legs. And if that lawyer had not come to my apartment that day and told me what he told me, I would have gone to my grave believing that I saw an old woman's legs get run over by a bus. And if I told you a story about how a homeless kid on Times Square saved my movie career, I'd have told it that way, including the fractured legs, absolutely certain that I was telling the truth. Yeah. So as far as I know, everything in this book is the truth. Now, I say some very mean things about my ex-wife in this book. I also say very mean things about me. I'm very self-critical by nature. And I'm just as critical of myself as I am of anybody else. I made a lot of mistakes in my marriage, beginning with marrying somebody I didn't love and who didn't love me. But all of that will be explained. I say this because I've taken a lot of criticism over the years since this was published for the way I treat Mem in this book. She said, the shit she said about me, she said to a judge. And the judge believed her and took my children away from me. And it was all lies. It wasn't anything misremembered. It was intentional lies. If I misremember something in this book, like, I saw that old lady get run over by a bus, I swear to God, even though I did not. I will take mea culpa. I'll take responsibility for that. But it is my right to tell my story. And that woman is a huge part of my story. So she features in this book from my point of view. And she is welcome to write her own book. But what she said about me, she didn't say in a book. She said it in a court. And it cost me dearly. And it was all lies. So I reckon we're even. At any rate, yeah, I'm going to take a quick break, and then I have to smoke a cigarette before I read this, before I launch on this. This is all very, very personal, and reading it is going to be kind of a trial. But the first essay, I think, is fairly short. I'm going to take a break, smoke a cigarette, and come back and do this. Well, I have closed the door. Maybe that'll keep some of the traffic noise down. All right. A woman of Bangkok. In the autumn of 1988, I spent 13 weeks in Atlantic City, New Jersey, working on a movie called Penn and Teller get killed. Penn and Teller were, or are, a comic magic act who were appearing in their first and only feature film. The director, Arthur Penn, had won Academy Awards for Bonnie and Clyde and Little Big Man, but was finishing his career with little indie projects starring relative unknowns. In one scene of this movie, Teller spends the afternoon in a movie theater. And in order to get the establishing shots of him entering and exiting the theater, the company rented an old nightclub called the Apollo. The mafia brought casino gambling into Atlantic City in the 1970s. And in an effort to keep the punters at the tables, they either bought out or burned out every other business in town, turning America's oldest seaside resort into a ghost town almost overnight. The Apollo was one of the businesses that refused to leave quietly. So one night in 1978, there was a suspicious fire, and the Apollo closed its doors forever after nearly 80 years of operation. I was a set dresser on the movie, and my job that morning was to put the words Three Stooges Film Festival on the marquee so the Apollo would look like a movie theater when the second unit came to shoot Teller entering and exiting. The old building had begun life as a vaudeville roadhouse, had been a movie theater and a burlesque venue, and finally ended its life as a jazz club. Smoke another cigarette, Steve. It still looked enough like a movie theater from the street. It had big brass-bound doors and a box office window and a marquee. Probably the Apollo's most attractive quality was that, like everything else in the gutted and vacant Atlantic City, it was dirt cheap to rent for the day. When my teamster and I rolled up, I had a key to the front door and instructions to find the big plastic marquee letters in a cardboard box in the attic. 2 labor unions, 100 years of movie crew tradition, and the man's own work ethic said the teamster should wait outside, napping in the truck. I let myself into a beautiful lobby carpeted in moldering burgundy wool and passed on into the theater itself. 10 inches of stagnant water left behind by the Atlantic City Fire Department formed a tideless and stagnant sea. There was no electricity, but my flashlight picked out rotting cafe tables which still held glassware and ashtrays full of grotesquely bloated 10-year-old cigarette butts. The tables made an archipelago between me and the stage. On a spectacular but soot-smudged neoclassical proscenium arch, crumbling plaster cherubim looked down with sad eyes at the velvet main curtain which hung in tatters over the bandstand. The fire had been confined to the auditorium, and as I climbed the stuffy, dark stairways to the attic, I peeked into offices and storerooms which had remained undisturbed since the owners of the building had escaped to Florida with their lives and the insurance money. I panned my flashlight around the dressing rooms, and they still seemed occupied, with postcards and pretty girls' pictures taped to the mirrors, and combs, toothbrushes, and tubes of hair pomade lining the dusty counters. The only sounds I heard were scuttling rats and dripping water. When I reached the attic, I found it crammed floor to ceiling with stacks of cardboard boxes. It looked like the last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Most of the boxes were labeled with a man's name and a dollar amount, like Sam Smith, $12.34, or Jack Jones, $21.95. As I tore open box after box to find the needle in the haystack that held my precious red marquee letters, I found the boxes all full of the same sorts of things that I had seen in the dressing rooms. In my frustration, I began to kick over the stacks of boxes that had rested undisturbed all those years, and piles of clothing, shoes, magazines, letters, hair oil, guitar picks, and clarinet reeds spilled across the floor. It occurred to me that what I'd discovered was a sad reminder of the gypsy life led by itinerant musicians in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. A man would come with the band and play an engagement of 3 weeks or 3 days, and during that time he would run up a bar bill. When it came time to go, if his bill exceeded the money he'd earned, the management would confiscate his meager belongings on his dressing table and put them in the attic. If the musician returned with the money, he got his things back. If not, they remained in the attic forever. I had made a hopeless confusion out of the carefully preserved effects of 100 dead men when I noticed in the gloom of a far corner 3 boxes, larger and more sturdy than the others, marked in black ink, marquee letters. I felt relief and shame in the same moment, and with my flashlight in my mouth, I made a vain attempt to put some order back into the place by stuffing double handfuls of clutter into boxes. And that's when I found 2 books. I picked them up and took them to the big long room's single small window for a look at them in better light, because among all the crap that I'd been digging through, among all the boxes of gaudy shirts and harmonicas and sheet music and condoms, they were the first books I'd seen. One was a simple black notebook in which a guitarist named F. Carlton Reeder had kept a daily log of his expenses. A typical entry might read, March 8th, new A string, 35 cents, union dues, $1.50, lunch with Mel, 75 cents. The journal began on January 1st, 1957, and ended on what must have been the day his engagement at the Apollo ended, and his belongings were put into the attic, November 6th, 1957. I was alone in a spooky old theater full of ghosts, in a spooky old town full of ghosts, holding the diary of a dead stranger, and the last entry in that diary was made on the day that I was born. After that eerie moment, I barely looked at the second book, but I did see that the cover showed a lurid illustration of a vaguely Asian woman wearing a low-cut gown. A Caucasian male figure was visible through a bead curtained doorway, and that was enough to make me put the book in my pocket and take it along. Atlantic City no longer had a laundromat or a hardware store, let alone a bookstore, and I needed something to read. I took the appropriate letters downstairs, got my ladder out of my truck, and in flagrant violation of Union Safety Code, I stood on the top of the ladder to write Three Stooges Film Festival on the Apollo's marquee. My teamster and I got lunch while the second unit got their shots, and when they left, I put the letters back in the attic without cleaning up the mess I had made. And when I got back to the hotel that night, I began to read the novel. It was Jack Reynolds' classic Thailand romance, A Woman of Bangkok. And expecting, as I was, a tawdry bit of titillation, I was amazed to discover that it was a novel of extraordinary sensitivity and insight. The glue of the book's binding had long since crystallized in the dry heat of the attic, and as I read my way through the book, each page came off the spine like a dead leaf. When I finished the book, I had a loose collection of 300 yellowed, fragile pages held together with a rubber band. But I didn't throw the book away. Soon after the movie wrapped, I was on a plane bound for Thailand. At 30,000 feet over the North Pole, I reread A Woman of Bangkok in the brilliant white light of the stratosphere, and the man in the seat next to me must have thought I was crazy to take such effort to read a 30-year-old trashy novel that left a snowdrift of crumbled paper in my lap with each page that I read. By the time we landed, the book was confetti, but that was okay. That book had lain in wait my entire life, and after doing its job, it disintegrated. A Woman of Bangkok is about a young Englishman who falls in love with a Thai dancing girl in Bangkok circa 1950. She takes all his money, breaks his heart, costs him his job, and finally leaves him to a future of failure and bitterness. But despite its turgid plot, the book is brilliantly written. It's a story full of wit, pathos, and plain old human drama, and it's one of my favorite books in the world. Of course, the Bangkok that Mr. Reynolds described, where Pat Pong Road was known only to the diplomats and the airline pilots, doesn't exist anymore. It had already vanished by the time I arrived in 1988. But if I ever did anything of any worth at all in the 7 years that I lived in Thailand, it was due to Jack Reynolds writing about the kingdom in a way that made me want to go there. Books are more powerful than bullets or missiles, but they're almost impossible to aim. A book may not strike its target until decades after the author is dead, but it will rest on a shelf or in a box for years, always armed and ready to explode in someone's head. All it takes is for one unsuspecting reader to trip over a book, like a Cambodian farmer tripping over an old landmine, to change his life forever. Well, that book certainly changed mine. And this is an example of why people say, "Oh, you're making it up, Steve. That can't be right." That diary went from January 1st, 1957 to November 6th, 1957, and then it stopped. That was the day I was born. That was the day that diary and that copy of A Woman of Bangkok were put in a box in the attic of the Apollo. 1957. It was 88 when I found the book. It was there for 30 years, sitting in that attic, undisturbed for 30 years, until it was found by a person whose birthday was the day he was born, not just his birthday, but the day he was born was the day that book got stored in that attic. And people look at that and say, "No, that's too much of a coincidence. That can't be right." But it is. That is exactly what happened. All of us have lives that are filled with these kinds of coincidences. I write about them. I leave out a lot of other stuff, like the name of the Teamster or what else I found up in that attic. But you talk about the stuff that's important. Somebody This story was written, like I said, in 93 for Living in Thailand magazine. So this is the oldest piece of writing in the book. And somebody, later it got online on Stickman's site, I think, and somebody went out and found the movie, Penn and Teller Get Killed, which is an awful movie, by the way, just a terrible, terrible movie. They found the movie and they did a screen capture of the marquee of Teller leaving the theater under the marquee that says Three Stooges Film Festival. And those were my marquee letters. You know, Arthur Penn directed that movie, and they had a newsletter. You know, but before the day of cell phones and the internet, we were making that movie in '88. And before the internet, the production companies used to put out a weekly newsletter. The production office would just on a Xerox machine put out a 10 or 12 page stapled together weekly newsletter for the crew. And they invited writing. And I started writing humorous anecdotes and things for this newsletter. And at some point, Arthur Penn's assistant came to me and said, you know, Arthur really loves your writing. He asked me to ask you if you have a script he could look at. Ha! And I didn't. I had never written a movie script. To this day, I've never completed a movie script. But when I went to Thailand for the first time, I went for 3 months. And I spent that 3 months writing about 3/4 of an unproducible screenplay because Arthur Penn had asked to see a screenplay. How many wannabe movie writers out there would give their left nut to have an Academy Award-winning director ask to see a screenplay from them? Now, I didn't have one to give him. I was a prop man. Anyway, so that's A Woman in Bangkok. I think this works much better in my voice. I don't have to do any accents. So we're going to carry on with this one. I hope you like it, Maddie. I'll see you later.